So hello, everyone, and welcome to the 44th NoBeC, or Norms in Behavioral Change talk. My name is Samira, and I'm the Managing Director of the Center for Social Norms and Behavioral Dynamics at the University of Pennsylvania. We have quite the compelling agenda for you today with two talks, and we're going to start with a very brief talk by an early career researcher, Paul Deutschmann, who is a postdoctoral fellow here at UPenn, and followed by the main talk with Professor Alex Imas from the University of Chicago Booth School of Business. After these talks, we'll have a Q&A segment open to all participants towards the end of today's session. And the Q&A will be facilitated by Eugen Diemant, who is a practice associate professor in the Master of Behavioral and Decision Sciences program here at UPenn. For a little bit of background, for anyone who might be new to this series or to the center, the NoBeC talks are organized by the Center for Social Norms and Behavioral Dynamics at the University of Pennsylvania, with the support of the Philosophy, Politics, and Economics program, and in partnership with the Master of Behavioral and Decision Sciences program. The center itself is a research center which provides specialized consulting, research, and training services to organizations throughout the world seeking to enact positive behavioral change. Here you can see the schedule of NoBeC talks lined up through the end of this year with speakers from the following institutions: the National Research Council of Italy, Carnegie Mellon University, and the Norwegian School of Economics. And then you guys can stay tuned for speakers that we'll have from January 2024 onwards. And before we get started, just a couple of ground rules. We kindly request that you please mute yourselves while the speakers are presenting. If possible, please do keep your camera on so that we can have a more interactive session. And for any questions, please feel free to use the chat at any time or raise your hand during the Q&A segment towards the end of today's session. And so with that, our first presentation is by an early career researcher, Paul Deutschmann. Paul is currently a postdoctoral fellow with the Philosophy, Politics, and Economics program here at the University of Pennsylvania. He's a social psychologist and behavioral scientist studying collective action and social norms. I'll just stop sharing my screen so that, Paul, you can go ahead and put up your presentation. And in the meantime, I'll share with the group that Paul's presentation today is on the following: people update their injunctive norm and moral beliefs after receiving descriptive norm information. So with that, Paul, I'll hand it over to you.
Great. Thank you so much for that introduction, Samira. Like she said, my name is Paul Deutschmann. I'm a postdoctoral fellow here at Penn, and I'm really excited to share some work from my dissertation today, looking at how people update their injunctive norm and moral beliefs after receiving descriptive norm information. All right, so imagine you're in the library one day and you see a friend there that you haven't seen in a while and you want to catch up with, but you're not sure whether it's okay to talk in this library. You look around and you see that very few people are talking. So because it's not very common, you might then infer that most people don't approve of people talking in the library, and thus you might be unlikely to start doing so yourself. Now imagine the same scenario, but this time most of the people around you are talking. So not only might you be more likely to start chatting in this case, but you might also have different beliefs about what others in this library condone. And it might be these changes in your beliefs about others' beliefs and expectations that are driving your increased propensity to now start talking in this context. So I think that example highlights how the two types of norms that have been most studied in the psychological literature, descriptive norms and injunctive norms, are really closely interconnected concepts. And just as a refresher, descriptive norms are what we think is commonly or frequently done. It's what we see other people doing, while injunctive norms are what we think other people approve of or condone. And there's a growing body of work that descriptive and injunctive norms are highly related. So for example, people both implicitly and explicitly associate descriptive and injunctive norms. And other work in the common as moral heuristic finds that people think behaviors are more moral when they're common than when they're rare, suggesting that moral judgments are also closely tied to descriptive and injunctive norms. So while it's increasingly clear that there's a strong relationship between descriptive and injunctive norms and moral judgments, there's still a lot we don't yet know about how descriptive norm information actually shapes injunctive and moral beliefs. So for example, it's still unclear whether people update their own beliefs in response to novel descriptive norm information, and if so, whether belief updating is sensitive to the strength of that information. So the main research question in this project then was whether people would update their injunctive and moral beliefs after receiving descriptive norm information. So across all the experiments in this project, we presented participants with a series of vignettes detailing different normative behaviors and manipulated the strength of the descriptive norm information with two conditions. So we had a strong condition in which 80% of people were engaging in the behavior, and a weak descriptive norm condition in which only 20% of people were engaging in the behavior. And you can see that we vary the denominator for those conditions between vignettes. And we ran 6 experiments in total with just under 2,700 participants recruited from Amazon's Mechanical Turk. Across all experiments, the descriptive norm manipulation was always between subjects. And we also varied the category of norm across studies, as you can see here, although the results I'll show today collapse across these categories for the sake of time. And for experiments 2 to 5, we measured updating by assessing beliefs before and after presenting the descriptive norm information with the filler task in between to try to reduce demand effects. And specifically, we calculated belief updating by subtracting participants' prior norm ratings from post norm ratings for each dependent variable. And the 3 key dependent variables I'll be talking about today are injunctive normativity and then 2 morality measures. So other morality, which is second-order moral beliefs about what other people find to be moral, and then personal morality, which are first-order moral judgments. So let's just dive straight into the results here. So we have injunctive ratings on the y-axis, pre-post descriptive norm manipulation on the x-axis, and the circles are going to show the strong descriptive norm condition where the behavior is common, and the triangle is the weak condition where it is uncommon. And you can see that people's priors are about the same as we would expect, and we're finding a pretty robust effect of updating here, such that after receiving a strong descriptive norm that the behavior is common, people are positively updating their injunctive beliefs, saying it's more injunctive. And we're seeing a smaller effect of negative updating, such that after receiving a weak descriptive norm, people think that it is less injunctively normative. So now let's look at the morality measures. So we have other morality on the left, personal morality on the right. And you can see here, we're finding a similar pattern of updating. So people are positively updating after receiving a strong descriptive norm that the behavior is common, saying that the behavior is more moral, and then other people find it to be more moral. And then to a lesser extent, we're finding a weak effect of negative updating. So after receiving information that the behavior is relatively uncommon, people are saying it's less moral and that other people find it to be slightly less moral. But interestingly, we see an association between second order and first order moral judgments here. So people think that other people's moral beliefs are more sensitive to descriptive norms, that they're more flexible than in fact they really are. We also ran a mediation using structural equation modeling to look at the role of injunctive beliefs in mediating the effect of descriptive norms on behavioral intentions. And we find that injunctive ratings explain around a quarter of the variance in the effect of descriptive norms on behavior, suggesting that a part of why descriptive norms influence behavior might be due to its effect on injunctive beliefs. So in sum, we do find evidence that people update their injunctive and moral norm beliefs after receiving descriptive norm information, and that they do so to varying extents depending on the strength of that information. In a similarly designed developmental study that I really did not have time to get into today, I find that already by age 6, children can selectively incorporate descriptive norm information into their injunctive norm beliefs and moral evaluations, suggesting that this is perhaps a relatively more foundational feature of social norm cognition. So overall, I think our findings demonstrate the important role descriptive norms play in shaping injunctive norms and moral judgments, and more generally, how our beliefs about what others do and believe play a really critical role in social norm cognition. So thank you all for listening. Thank you to my collaborators, and you can find a preprint of that paper at the QR code. So thank you all. I'm happy to take a question if there's time.
Great, thank you so much, Paul. And we're just reminding everyone that also, it's excellent to see that we have about 82 participants already on this session. Just a reminder to everyone that if you have a question for Paul, please feel free to raise your hand or place a question in the chat. If not now, we can come to it later. I don't see anything as of yet, but Paul, we can come back to that at a later time. But thank you again. And so with that, we can move on to today's main talk, which is going to be by Professor Alex Imas. Alex is an associate professor of behavioral science and economics at the University of Chicago Booth School of Business, where he teaches negotiations and behavioral economics. His research spans a variety of topics across economics and psychology, where he explores the role of systemic factors and incorrect beliefs in discrimination, how to better motivate performance by incorporating psychology into incentives, among other topics. So Alex, please feel free to share your screen. And in the meantime, I'll share the title of your talk today, which is Over and Underreaction to Information. So with that, over to you, Alex.
Great, thank you so much. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Thumbs up. Okay, great, thank you. Thanks for a great presentation, Paul, and thank you for having me here. I think it's great that this talk followed Paul's, because it's also on how people over and underreact to information, how they react to information in general. So this is with Schwayman Bob, and who's now at the University of Pittsburgh, and Aislinn Bourne, who's at the University of Pennsylvania. So before getting into kind of the more general question of how people react to information, I wanted to start with a kind of a very basic setting that's been used a lot to study how people react to information. And from that basic setting to kind of build up to a more realistic setting to try to explore this question. But in general, I just like to kind of motivate the talk with this being kind of a very fundamental question, which is kind of why the title is so broad. You could think about information as descriptive norms. You could think about also about information just as good or bad news about something happening or not. And that's kind of be the kind of setting that we're going to be talking about more here. So to get into the specifics, take the following setting. Let's say there's 100 cards. Each of those cards has either earn A or earn B written on them. And depending on what card is drawn from this deck, earn A or earn B is going to be used in the experiment. So the experimenter will draw a card. It's going to be earn A or earn B. That's going to be the earn used. They're going to put their hand into the urn and draw a ball, and then they're going to show the participant in this experiment a ball. So here's a red ball. Now, on top of that, the participant is asked, what is the probability that earn A was the one chosen? They're also given the following information to make that decision. So for example, in this case, they're given the following information, that there's 50 earn A and 50 earn B cards. What that basically means is that before having any more information, it's basically random whether earn A or earn B is chosen. They have completely equal likelihoods. The other part of the information that you're given is the fact that earn A has more red balls than blue balls, namely 70 red balls and 30 blue balls, and earn B has 30 red balls and 70 blue balls. So essentially, what you can use this paradigm to do is to think about how people should update their beliefs and compare that to how people do actually update their beliefs. Particularly, we have an answer for how people should update their beliefs, because Bayes' rule can be used very easily in this setting to essentially give us a normative benchmark to think about, without conditional on no information loss, how people should update their beliefs, specifically using this formula. So in this formula, you have the prior belief, namely seeing no information at all yet. What should your belief be on earn A versus earn B being the one used in this experiment? Here it's 50-50. So that's the prior belief. And then you have information on the diagnosticity of a particular signal. How informative is seeing a red ball? In this case, it's pretty informative that that a particular color was drawn, because earn A, has more red balls than earn B. And so essentially, when you see a red ball, you should go from 50-50 to something like, look, there's a higher probability of that earn A was actually used in this experiment. And this formula tells you exactly how you should update their beliefs. You have all of the basic components here. Particularly, you have the prior belief, which is 50-50. You have the diagnosticity or the informativeness of the signal, which is either 0.7 that conditional on earn A being used, there's a 0.7 chance of seeing a red ball. Conditional on earn B being used, there's only a 30% chance of seeing a red ball. And you have what we refer to as the complexity of the state space, namely how many different scenarios should I be thinking about? It's just two, is it earn A or earn B? So in this particular setting, the person should go from 50-50 to thinking there's a 70% chance that earn A was actually being used here. This paradigm has been run hundreds, if not thousands of times to study how people update their beliefs. And the reason that this paradigm has been used so much is because it has all of the kind of general properties we would want to start thinking about how people update their beliefs to information. So rather than this abstract setting of urns and cards, you could think about a trader thinking about a stock, whether it's a good stock or a bad stock. They're not sure about it. All they know is whether the prices are going up and down. They know that a good stock has a higher probability of a price increase than a price decrease, and they know that a bad stock has the opposite. So when they see a price increase here, you could think about, rather than a red ball, it's being a price increase, they should update their beliefs that this is actually a good stock rather than a bad stock. So as I said, this paradigm has been used a lot to study how people update their beliefs. So we could start thinking about how, compared to this Bayesian benchmark, how do they update their beliefs? So there's been a lot of work on this, partly in the lab. So this paradigm was first used by Ward Edwards in 1968, and it's been continued to be used by many other people. And basically, using that paradigm, one of the stylized quote-unquote facts is that people are conservative in their belief updating. They don't go all the way to 0.7. They go to something like 0.6, 0.65, which is typically referred to as people being conservative Bayesian. They go in the right direction, but not all the way. But there's been a lot of other work using financial data and things like that, thinking about how do people update their beliefs in quote-unquote the real world. And essentially, what these people have found is that much of the literature in the lab has found evidence for underreaction or conservative Bayesian, but in finance and in a lot of real-world settings, people have found evidence for overreaction. People actually update their beliefs more than they should. So in the earned setting, rather than going to 0.7, they go to something like 0.75 or 0.8. So they over-update their beliefs. So here, the evidence, as you can see, is inconsistent. There's also been several reviews of the literature, and these reviews of the literature basically kind of try to summarize it. So Dan Benjamin has a very influential handbook chapter in 2019, where he tries to summarize all of the experimental evidence on over and underreaction to how people respond to information. And he summarizes it as basically saying that people generally underinfer or underreact to information. On the other hand, there's been a review chapter of how people react to information in financial markets. Excuse me. And here the evidence is different. Basically, the summary is that people generally overreact to information, and this is summarized in this Bordalo paper with Andre Schleifer and Nicola Giannoli and others, that the expectation of professional forecasters, corporate managers, consumers, and investors appears to be systematically biased in the direction of overreaction. So given kind of the importance of understanding how people react to information, one of the goals of the current paper is to try to understand when are people more likely to overreact versus when are they more likely to underreact to information. And our approach is to first develop a conceptual framework where before actually processing information, the first step of the model is to determine what information is actually consumed or attended to before it's processed. So there's a growing literature in behavioral economics and cognitive psychology that when facing complex learning environments, people first simplify the information structure before actually forming their beliefs. So this is the approach we take in this paper. We develop a model where in the first stage, and I'll present kind of the formalism of the model later in the talk, but basically in the first stage, which we call the editing stage, the agent reduces potential complexity of the information structure that they basically can't reasonably consume in the time or cognitive resources that they have. So we know from cognitive psychology that working memory has a fixed capacity, that, for example, there are these loose rules for the number of objects a person can consider. And here you could think about the number of states in a particular information structure. So when there's two urns, A and B, it's kind of easy for me to think about both urns at the same time. What if instead of updating on two urns, I was updating on many more urns? I can't really think about all of the urns at the same time when forming my beliefs. So before forming the beliefs, I'll somehow simplify that information structure. In the words of Xavier Gabec in the 2014 paper, people basically form a sparse representation of the information structure where they can't attend to everything at the same time. So some of the things they kind of edit out when forming their beliefs. And particularly, we argue that people use the representativeness heuristic when reducing complexity. So they basically channel more attention to the states that are most likely to generate the signal that they see. So if I'm a trader and I see an IPO of a stock, the price goes up. Normal average stocks have some probability of a price increase, but which types of stocks are most likely to generate a price increase? Well, it's the really good stocks. So I overweigh the probability that this is the next Google or some other unicorn when forming my beliefs, and put less weight on kind of the intermediate potential states. So I use the representativeness heuristic to essentially edit my beliefs. And notice this heuristic has very little bite in sort of simple settings where there's only two states. In the second stage, we basically conjecture that people use this simplified information structure and apply Bayes' rule, but with some noise. So people apply Bayes' rule, but essentially they treat the parameters that they're presented with as signals in a signal extraction problem, which basically generates some insensitivity to changes in that information structure. So these sort of noisy cognition models have recently gotten a lot of support in the literature, particularly in the work of Michael Woodford and Zaviga Bext. So this model actually generates a very rich set of predictions based on the interaction of these two forces. We take these rich predictions and we can derive comparative statics based on the complexity of the state space, the informativeness of the signal, and the shape of the prior distribution. And we actually predict that people will overreact to information in complex information structures. So when you're thinking about real world settings, when a stock is not just good or bad, but it could be pretty good or very good or really, really good, our model actually predicts that you should observe overreaction. Additionally, when you see concentrated priors or noisy or disconfirming signals, we also predict overreaction. On the other hand, our model predicts that people will underreact when the state space is very simple and easy to think about, and when priors are diffuse, or when the signal that you see is something that you already expect. So given these predictions, we actually run an experiment with over 2,000 participants where we vary all of these different parameters and test each of these predictions. So the first thing is that we replicate the level of underreaction in very simple two-state settings. So in the review of literature that Dan Benjamin wrote, he basically reviewed all of the experimental evidence. And one thing to note from that experimental evidence is that the vast majority of experiments only use two urns. So we replicate that. When people just use two urns, we also see underreaction in those settings. But on the other hand, we see that as complexity increases by just a single state, so if you switch from two urns just to three, the bias completely reverses direction, and we observe overreaction as the dominant force. With more concentrated priors, as you put more weight on those middle states, the extent of overreaction increases substantially. And even in simple settings, we show that when signals are surprising, we observe overreaction there as well. We also provide direct evidence for the specific attentional mechanism, namely that as the information structure becomes more complex, people become much more attentive to the representative states and kind of ignore the states in the middle, which is consistent with our model. As with all behavioral models, we're adding extra degrees of freedom. So one thing that we do in the paper is to measure the extent to which these extra degrees of freedom bias as far as added explanatory power. We use the framework that Drew Freudenberg, Annie Liang, and others have developed to measure the completeness of the model relative to the more simple behavioral models that people have been using so far. We show that with two states, just in the standard two-urn setting, just the cognitive noise model without this extra step of simplification does a very complete job of explaining the data. But if you increase that setting to even two states, to even three states, just to add one extra state, cognitive noise now only explains 0.4 of the explainable variation, and adding this extra stage of simplification increases the explanatory power by 0.93 out of 1, which is kind of what we view as a substantial increase in explanatory power. Finally, we map basically what we see in the experiments to the sort of the prior literature, and we show that we can start basically rationalizing the discrepancy between over and underreaction in prior work by showing that essentially when the setting is more complex, people find overreaction. When the setting is less complex, people find underreaction, which is consistent with our data. Any questions thus far?
No, looking good. No questions in the chat.
No? Okay. And when do I have until, sorry? Until
You have
2?
like 35 minutes, yeah.
Okay, perfect.
Oh, there's actually a question. I don't know if Timothy, maybe you want to put this in the chat and then we'll just evaluate that along the way.
I'm happy to answer questions as they come up. It's somebody else.
All right, Timothy, so feel free if you want to ask.
So in this particular experiment, you're manipulating complexity by going from 2 to 3 states. Would your theory still be true if you just maybe increase the complexity of the signal? For instance, in this, maybe the experimenter grabs a handful of balls, like 5 or 6. So now they've got to use some binomial updating rule or so on, which is much more complex than the example. Would that mean you'd see over or underreaction?
So that's a great question. So our theory does not define complexity specifically as this manipulation of increasing the state space. We conjecture that's one aspect of complexity, and we show that our model generates overreaction for that one aspect of complexity. Our model is rich enough to handle other aspects of complexity. We just don't derive those comparative statics in this paper. But in follow-up work, we're actually doing precisely that, which is increasing the signal space and also increasing kind of the complexity of the prior. So for example, we have kind of these smooth distributions. You might think of other sorts of distributions, which are much more complicated to think about. And our model can generate predictions there as well to see whether you're getting over and underreaction. That's just not something we test here, but I'm on the same page with you that obviously the state space isn't the only dimension of complexity you should consider. It's just the most natural one for the type of kind of financial market settings that we think about, where people typically think of price increases and decreases as kind of a binary signal. And the state space of the assets is actually the things that are more complex about those settings than the laboratory settings.
Yeah, agree. The only reason I asked, and this is probably shameless self-promotion, is I did the same exact experiment, except I draw 6 balls routinely. And so that binomial is actually fairly complex, but you just count the colors and I see massive underreaction.
Yeah, and that would,
and as I go from like 6
actually,
to 12 balls, I even get more underreaction.
So that's actually consistent with our model. Namely, if you add that aspect, so when I say complexity, I really mean increasing complexity of the state space, and we make that very explicit in the paper. The prediction for complexity for balls actually goes in the opposite direction.
Gotcha. I misunderstood your last statement then.
I'm sorry about that. I probably wasn't clear. Okay, so again, before getting into the theory, I wanted to kind of discuss the experimental setup because it was explicitly designed to mirror kind of the theoretical framework. So just to kind of organize concepts, I'll go through the design first and then go into the theoretical model. So we pre-registered this experiment with 2,200 participants. There's a series of attention and comprehension checks to give us confidence that we're actually, picking up reasonable answers. The incentives were a $2 base fee and a $10 bonus payment if a randomly selected answer was within 3% of the Bayesian posterior. This is a commonly used way of incentivizing beliefs. You might think about, why didn't we use the quadratic scoring rule or something like that? There's a recent paper in the AER by David Donst, Lise Vesterland, and Alistair Wilson showing that the quadratic scoring rule or the binary scoring rule can actually bias you towards finding conservatism, which is the reason we didn't use it here. So everybody answered between 8 and 15 questions in random order. The variation that we introduce is complexity, and to Timothy's point, this is state space complexity, and I want to be clear about that. We changed the diagnosticity of the signal, how informative it is, and also the concentration of the prior, how flat or symmetric it is across the state space. So here's how we did it. So we told people the basic setup that I told you in the beginning of the talk. There's 100 different cards. Each card has either earn A or B or earn C written on it. So here, this is a state space that has 3 potential earns, not 2. And you will know how many of the cards each have earn A, earn B, or C written. So this is just 2 signals, red and blue. You might think of different colors as well, but that's not what we do in this paper. We show people the basic structure of the experiment. And we tell them basically kind of how the cards are drawn. We also show it to them on the screen. We basically show them that there's 3 different potential earns, earn A, earn B, and earn C. This is the concentrated prior treatment here. So there's a higher probability of the middle earn than the more extreme earn. We also have a uniform treatment, where we have the exact same probability of each of those earns being drawn. And then here is the prior, and here's the diagnosticity of the information. So here, earn A contains more red balls than blue balls. Earn C contains more blue balls than red balls, and earn B contains 50-50 earn, 50-50. So here's the theoretical framework. Let's take a state space where a state is drawn from a state space between 0 and 1 with n distinct states in ascending order. So they're ordered. So this is a specific setting called a good news, bad news setting, which is typically used in financial applications. So basically a good stock or a bad stock is ordered according to the probability of a particular signal being seen, which is a good signal or a bad signal. And this is the one we use here as well. There's a prior probability over the state space. There's a signal drawn. This is a binary signal, either red or blue. The probability that a particular signal is drawn conditional on a state is equal to the number in the state. So this notice maps directly into our experimental setting. So the probability of a blue ball being drawn from a 70 blue ball, 30 red ball earn is 70%. So this precisely maps onto our experimental setting. And we have an objective prior, which is derived through Bayes' rule. We have 2 stages. We have the 2-stage model of belief formation. In the first stage, in the editing stage, attention and working memory constraints lead the agent to simplify the information structure, where people channel more attention to the states that are most representative of a particular signal. We can quantify this using the following formula that was proposed by a series of papers by Pedro Bordalo, Nicola Giannoli, and Andre Schleifer with co-authors. So essentially, the representativeness of a particular state given a signal is the extent to which the posterior increases relative to the prior. If the posterior increases a lot relative to the prior, that state is representative of the signal because it's the most likely state to generate that signal. Now, in the editing stage, the edited posterior takes this information structure that's been transformed through representativeness and essentially applies Bayes' rule with some noise. Sorry, I'm still, this is the edited posterior here. So this is the evaluation stage. The agent takes the noisy representation of the edited posterior, uses Bayes' rule by apply said noise. What that implies is that a person comes in with a certain cognitive default, so a certain anchor when thinking about a situation, and they're given information, but they don't move all the way based on that information. Namely, they shade towards the cognitive default. So people use Bayes' rule to update their beliefs from the prior and the realized representation given the edited posterior. We focus on the mean observed posterior and basically the actual subjective posterior that we're going to be using in the studies, which are the beliefs that the people give us, is assumed to be a linear combination between people's cognitive default, which is assumed to be kind of the ignorance prior, so they don't have any information, what prior did they come in with, and the actual edited posterior from using Bayes' rule. So defining over and underreaction, that's basically the extent to which a Bayesian agent would update compared to how the participant updates. So let's say people see a red ball, the extent to which a Bayesian agent would update towards the urn that has the most red balls, we compare that to the extent to the subject updates. So if the subject updates more than that, they overreact. If the subject updates less than that, they underreact. So then what we do is we define an over and underreaction ratio to account for the fact that you cannot update as much when you're already kind of seeing very extreme states. We basically normalize the over and underreaction difference by the extent to which a Bayesian agent could, in principle, over and underreact. So when this ratio is more than 0, people overreact. When it's less than 0, people underreact. So in the interest of time, I'm going to kind of skip some of the theoretical setup here about the properties of the informational environment and get into the first prediction. Basically, the first prediction of the model is when you have two information structures with a symmetric state space and uniform priors, denote the overreaction ratio for each of these information structures. Our first prediction is keeping the range of possible states constant. The more you're more likely to observe overreaction in the more complex state space, namely with more internal states, than the same than a state space that's simpler with the same range. So that's the first thing that I'm gonna be providing you evidence for. So to test prediction 1, we basically have a range of potential signal diagnosticities, namely the likelihood that you're to see a particular red or blue ball, going from very uninformative signals. So let's say you have a 60% chance of seeing a red ball versus a 90% chance of seeing a red ball, which is a very informative signal structure. And then we're going to essentially increase the complexity, going from 2 states to 3 states, adding a middle urn, to 4 states, adding 2 middle urns, to 5 states, adding 3 internal urns. And we're also going to show you evidence from an 11-state setting where we're basically seeing a setting with 10 different urns. Here, I'm going to give you evidence just from uniform priors. So the first thing that I'm going to show you is the fact that, so this, on the y-axis, you see the fraction of over and underreaction. So here, what you see is negative numbers means people are underreacting relative to overreacting, and the opposite to when you see positive numbers. So here with 2 states, just with 2 urns, we replicate all of those standard results from the lab. People are generally underreacting. And here's the data across all of the signal diagnosticities. People are underreacting across all of the signal diagnosticities, which again replicates the standard lab results. What happens when you add just 1 extra state? What happens when you go from 2 states to 3 states? The entire picture changes. The direction of the bias reverses. Now you're seeing overreaction across every single signal diagnosticity, with the most overreaction for the noisiest signals. Does anybody have any questions so far?
Looking good.
Looking good. So here's the 5-state case. This is with 5 urns. As you can see, there's more overreaction here. And you could kind of just order it going from 2 states to all the way to 11 states. You see this monotonic increase to overreaction. So it's not like we're observing a fluke with the 3-state case. With 4 states, you get a bit more overreaction. With 5 states, you get a bit more, and you get even more with 11 states. So really, the fluke in the experimental literature seems to be the fact that people were using 2 urns when trying to understand how people over and underreact to information. It seems this 2-state case was very much a special case.
Alex, sorry, I have a basic question, and maybe you mentioned that, but it relates to sort of your interpretation of the results. I mean, one of the things that correlates with, let's say, overreaction could be just a poor understanding of the setup that you present, right? I'm sure you control for, comprehension, all of those things. But so how do you disentangle that in your data, if at all? That complexity might also just be leading to a worse understanding, and then the people just do that thing.
So that would give us basically greater noise, or people basically kind of reporting the same thing regardless of the structure. So correct me if I'm wrong. Let me rephrase your question. That people are confused. They're generally giving us essentially the same answer, but we're moving the Bayesian benchmark. And so the same answer will be coded as underreaction, sometimes an overreaction other times. But really, they're just confused. Is that basically what you're asking?
That's one possibility. Yeah. Mm.
So we do a couple of things to rule this out. The first thing, instead of thinking about over and underreaction as a kind of a average effect, we can look at the weight placed on every single state. So if people were generally confused, they'd basically be kind of randomizing how much they place on every state, and this would generate over and underreaction on average, but really it'll look like noise when you're looking state by state. That's not really what they're doing. They're really placing systematically less weight on the middle states and more weight on the representative states. And this is a function of the signal. When you see a blue ball, for example, the representative state is going to be the urn with the most blue balls. So with noise, we should see kind of a lot of weight still on the other urns, but really people are placing a lot of weight on that urn with the most blue balls and kind of ignoring the other aspects. So we can do an exercise like that. But I think the most convincing evidence is going to come from the attentional treatment, where we're going to keep the information structure exactly the same. But what we're going to do is we're going to restrict people's attention through a manipulation. And our manipulation is predicted when you decrease people's attention, they're going to use the representativeness heuristic more. And therefore, we're going to be observing more overreaction in the exact same setting. And that's precisely what we see. So it's not like we're changing the information structure, which could generate more confusion. We're keeping the information structure the same. All we're doing is restricting attention.
Great, yeah. I mean, I have a follow-up to that, but let me give Christina the word. She has a question.
Yep.
You muted, Christina. Sorry, let me unmute you. Wait, Christina, you muted.
Oh, 2 slides back.
2 slides back?
Yeah. Here, I find something I'm curious. Okay. So there seems to be some threshold effect with the signal diagnosticity, because you go up and up and up, but then you go down.
Yeah, so that's...
So it looks as if at a certain point, it doesn't seem to matter anymore. What happens? It's just a simple question, but I was very surprised that there is a peak, and then it looks as if there is a threshold of signal diagnosticity. Then after that, the business.
So sorry, this graph might be a bit confusing. These should be just mirror images of each other, because this is just looking at a red ball versus a blue ball and looking at urns that have, like, for example, 60-40 versus 40-60. So it should be going up and then down. So our model basically predicts the most overreaction for the noisiest signals, which is 40-60, and the least overreaction for the most precise, which is what basically 10 and 90 should look like.
Thank you.
Yeah, sorry about that.
It was not clear to me. Thank you very much.
Okay, cool. So our second prediction is on the concentration of the prior. So the prediction is essentially, as you add more concentration in the prior, putting more weight on the middle states, that's going to generate more overreaction in that information structure. And basically the intuition is the following. When you have a flat prior or a prior that puts a lot of weight to the extreme states already, representativeness doesn't have much bite, because even a Bayesian agent should put a lot of weight on those extreme states. But as you decrease the amount of weight that you put on those extreme states for a Bayesian agent, if a biased agent is editing out the middle, as we predict, then that's going to be the largest deviation in overreaction compared to the Bayesian benchmark. And so what we do in this experiment, we essentially take the 3-state experiment where we observed overreaction with a uniform prior, and we just put more weight on the middle or less weight on the middle relative to the uniform prior. And we predict the most overreaction in the concentrated prior, which puts most weight in the middle, and the least, which puts most weight on the extreme states. So this is the graph I've already presented to you. This is 3 states, uniform prior. here's what happens with a concentrated prior, and here's what happens with a more diffuse prior that puts more weight on the extreme states. As you can see, as the prior becomes more diffuse, you actually start seeing some underreaction, even with 3 states. So this is the kind of the interesting part where the sort of different mechanisms interact. So it's not like in a complex state space, you're always going to see overreaction. Depending on how the other primitives of the information structure interact with this, this will give you different comparative statics predictions. So finally, I'm going to show you evidence on the type of signal. So whether this signal is surprising or not, our model basically predicts that if you expect a signal, you're going to underreact to it. If you don't expect a signal, if it's surprising, you're going to overreact to it. And the intuition is very similar to the previous one. If it's a surprising signal, you're not putting a lot of weight on those extreme states, and therefore, as a Bayesian agent, whereas for a biased agent, they're putting too much weight on those extreme states, so they're going to overreact to the surprising signal. So we take the case with just 2 states, and we change the symmetry of the prior to make one state more versus less likely to generate these surprising signals. And basically what we find is this is the 50-50, which is no surprising or non-surprising because each state is equally likely. Again, this is underreaction. But if it's a surprising signal, we see overreaction. If it's a confirmatory signal, we see underreaction. Here's the same graph as before. Uniform prior is the green line, underreaction. Confirmatory signal, even more underreaction. Surprising signal, overreaction. So as I mentioned before, we have a experiment where we explicitly measure attention, where we use the mouse lab paradigm by Payne, Bettman, and Johnson, which basically argues and shows that you can use where people move their mouse as a proxy of attention, because basically the first thing that they kind of move to tracks with visual attention as far as the first thing that they look to. So we take our paradigm, and instead of letting people basically enter their beliefs for each urn, we make them actually click on the urn before entering the beliefs, and we measure which urn do they click on first, whether it's the representative urn, or if they're confused, they're just going to be clicking randomly, or if it's some different model, they'll be clicking on maybe the opposite of the representative urn. But our model basically predicts that if urn E has the most blue balls and you see a blue ball, you're most likely to click on that. If urn A has the most red balls and you see a red ball, you're most likely going to be clicking on that. And the really interesting thing about this paradigm is that it actually requires attention to operate, because now you kind of have to think about what to click on and which constrains your attention. And so given our model, we predict that if attention is constrained through the use of this paradigm, we're going to be observing more overreaction in this information structure with the mouse lab paradigm relative to the same exact information structure with 5 urns, where people can just enter their beliefs without having to click. So the first thing I'm going to show you is the clicking data. What urn do people click on first? The nice thing is that we can actually show that, look, this is not just random clicking. When state 1, when urn A is representative, they're a lot more likely to click on that first. When urn E, or the 5th state, is representative, they're a lot more likely to click on that first. So this is really consistent evidence with the fact that they're really attending to the representative urn more consistent with the model. What does their belief updating look like? This is the original graph in the 5-state case where they could just enter their beliefs. When you actually constrain their attention using this paradigm, we observe significantly more overreaction across the entire signal diagnosticity distribution. So when people have less attention to use, they overreact more because they're basically paying attention to the representative urn even more than in the case where their attention is not constrained. We could also split people by whether they click on the representative urn first or not. And here we see way more overreaction amongst those who are consistent with the representativeness heuristic versus those who are not. So in the last part of the paper, I'm going to try to tell you that and show you evidence for it, that our model is actually useful as far as added value and explanatory power. So the first thing I'm going to show you is how complete is our model in explaining the variation in the data relative to simpler models that are already in the literature. Now, our model is potentially more has more degrees of freedom than other models. And so the last thing I'm going to show you is how much flexibility do we introduce by our model, how falsifiable our model is in the data relative to other models in the literature. So that using the restrictiveness exercise that Freudenberg, Gao, and Liang proposed in 2022. So what is completeness? So I'm not going to go through this in a lot of detail, but essentially what completeness does is to calculate a ratio between the amount of variation that you could potentially explain in the data and compare that to the amount of variation that your model can explain to the data relative to the base model, here being Bayes' rule. So the Bayes' rule model, if, for example, your completeness ratio is equal to 0, what that means is that you're not explaining any more data than Bayes' rule. If it's equal to 1, you're explaining as much variation as you can possibly explain. What does possibly explain mean? How do you calculate that? Well, the paper by Freudenberg, Liang, and Nathan actually offers an algorithm for doing this. It's essentially using machine learning to see how a model-free kind of approach to trying to explain as much data as you can explain of that data, and comparing that to your much more structured approach of using a theoretical model, how much your theoretical model can explain in the data. So the machine learning is going to be the denominator, your model is going to be the numerator. So first, let's start with just two states, two ergs. That coefficient is equal to 1. Basically, the two-stage model can explain almost all of the data, essentially all of the data that can be explained using machine learning. Using the noisy cognition model, the second stage, you just match that. You could explain all of the available variation, the explainable variation, just using cognitive noise. The two-stage model doesn't buy you anything on top of that, which we think is why these sorts of cognitive noise models have been so popular when thinking about belief updating. They do really, really well in the settings that people have used them for, which are these simple two-erg experiments that have been run in the past. But what happens when you increase complexity by just even one more state? The cognitive noise only model, the explanatory power drops all the way to 0.36. And you really need representativeness, the first stage, in order to get that statistic closer to 1, which is 0.92. So we have a tremendous increase in explanatory power by thinking about how people respond to complexity in belief updating environments. What this does is suggest that these two forces are not just substitutes or acting independently, they're actually cognitive complements. The representativeness and cognitive imprecision act in concert in explaining this data. When you're thinking about them independently, representativeness only does very poorly, and the cognitive noise model does fairly poorly as well. You really need both in order to get completeness all the way up to 0.92. The structural estimation in the completeness exercise also allows us to say, like, look, how much of our sample is biased with 1 or 2 or none of the heuristics that we propose. Over 70% of the people in our sample display both stages of our model. Notably, they both simplify the information structure and add cognitive noise to that process. Only 16% of our sample look unbiased. Additionally, simplification and cognitive noise are positively correlated, suggesting that bounds on general cognitive capacity drive both processes. So finally, as promised, we compute the restrictiveness of the model in the sense of, let's say I calculated a random data set of belief updating that's not driven by behavior. It's just saying, look, I'm going to do the following thing. I'm going to say red signal, and then I'm going to choose a random number in the direction of the of an urn with more red balls. This is basically saying, can our model explain data that that is not consistent with human behavior? It was just randomly generated. A model that's not falsifiable would do a very good job at explaining this generated data as well, because it's not falsifiable. Whereas a falsifiable model would say, look, we can't explain this data. We can only explain the data that's actually generated by human subjects. So what I'm showing you here is a restrictiveness completeness frontier, which basically says that basically you have models that are more complete. Obviously, a completely flexible, unfalsifiable model is going to be very complete because it explain anything, but it's going to not be restrictive because it's not falsifiable. Whereas a model that's very not complete is also restrictive because it can't predict anything, but it's also very easily to falsify. So in our framework, basically the cognitive noise model is not very complete. Remember, that's 0.36, but it's fairly restrictive, which is good. So what does our two-stage model look like? Well, it's very complete, but we don't lose out on much restrictiveness either. It can be easily ruled out using the synthetic data. So to summarize, we develop a framework that incorporates multiple psychological mechanisms. We predict over and under reaction as a function of the information structure, and we provide support for these predictions using both behavioral data and data from an attentional experiment. Our results point to a methodology for a unified approach to thinking about modeling multiple psychological phenomena simultaneously, particularly because our model suggests that these multiple psychological phenomena are actually complements, and it's important to model both in order to generate a rich set of realistic predictions. So with that, thank you so much for your attention, and I'm happy to take any questions you might have.
Great, thank you so much, Alex. And Eugen, I'll hand it over to you to facilitate the Q&A.
Great. I mean, we had two questions. One I had responded to, which is a link to a citation. The other one is Ramadan. You are still in the audience. Do you want to ask openly, or should I just read out? All right, happy to read it out. Oh, okay, great. So he had a more general question. And so he says, how does the concept of underreaction and overreaction manifest in violence prevention interventions? I'm asking from a perspective of a lay program designer. So I guess more of a like general implications of your research.
So the research has implications for kind of thinking about welfare in financial markets, for example, because it suggests that retail traders, which aren't like programmatic in how they attend to or evaluate information, will tend to overreact to information and potentially kind of herd or essentially generate momentum in asset markets and buy assets that are more likely to mean revert or something like that. So they're more likely to overreact to information and then end up losing money as a result. So one way to kind of avoid that is to present information in a more simplified way, is to, rather than, presenting everything, asking them to evaluate the very complex state space, presenting it in a more simplified way. And just in general, I think I view this as kind of a more basic scientific result that hopefully others, including our own team, can build on as far as thinking about interventions and thinking about how this potentially can kind of bias people in the real world.
Maybe you follow up on that. Do you have a sense for, let's say, psychological mechanisms that would predict to some degree what complexity means at the individual level, right? I mean, there's some heterogeneity. What some people perceive as complex might not be as complex to others. So if you wanted to actually run interventions, you might want to find a way to be able to predict, right? Who is affected how. So do you have any sense of how that could look like, what that could look like in an intervention sense?
Yeah, so the neat thing about defining complexity as we have is this notion of complexity as the size of the state space actually kind of mirrors the neuroscience literature about how many objects people can consider at any given time, which is kind of already the definition. People can't keep track of, like, let's say 100 objects at any given time. They can't even keep track of 10. So as you increase complexity, using the notion that we have, there's not going to be a lot of heterogeneity. Like a a state space with 10 different objects is going to be complex for everybody who's not using some sort of decision tool. So it's not going to be that some people are going to be viewing this as a simple problem versus other people are going to be viewing it as a complicated problem. At the neural level, 10 is more complicated than 1. There's other notions of complexity, like the ones that you alluded to, like, for example, you know, the CRT task or something like that. People can just some people can get it right away. For other people, it's a much more complicated mathematical problem. In our case, this is not really the setting, because it's really the complex type of complexity we're talking about is at the neurological level.
Great. We have a question in the chat. I wonder whether these psychological mechanisms intertwine with individuals' risk preference, especially when the amount of states is high.
The only thing I can say is that the two heuristics, which are not theoretically supposed to relate to one another, are very positively correlated. So to the extent that you view some notion of risk preferences being driven by bounded rationality, they should correlate with these heuristics as well. So if you think about loss aversion as essentially being driven by bounded rationality, then the prediction would be that people who are going to be more likely to overreact are also going to be more risk averse or something like that. But I don't have any data on this. This is just conjectures.
Great. Any other questions for Alex? So we talked about next steps and sort of related work. Maybe you can give us a little preview of things that
yeah, so I mean, we're thinking about testing the model in settings where the representative state is not the most extreme state. So to kind of like look in whether it's like really based on the type of setting that we've chosen versus whether the model is actually like people are actually using representativeness more broadly. As I alluded to Timothy, we're also thinking about complexity on other dimensions such as the signal space and the number of signals. And that's going to generate different predictions than the ones that we have in the paper. We're viewing this as basically kind of like a first step about thinking about one type of complexity in belief updating, but it's obviously a much richer space that we're exploring further. But I don't have any data other than on the multiple balls being drawn, and hopefully we'll develop that and have more data in the future.
Okay, great. We have another question. Please go ahead and feel free to open your mic to ask.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Alex. I was just wondering if the feature of the demographics, like the subjects, would matter. For example, if we separate subjects such as primary school children compared to adults who are more cognitively developed, would that, would this kind of design provide some different data based on your current study?
That's not something we explored, but you can easily do that because we can measure the extent of heuristic use at an individual level using our design. You could test the hypothesis that, like, primary school children, which may not be as sophisticated as stock traders or something like that, whether they overreact more in particular settings versus others because they're more prone to something like the representativeness heuristic. But that's not something we've done so far.
Okay, great. Well, thank you.
Thank you.
I see a hand raised from Christina. Please go ahead. Feel free to unmute yourself. Christina, sorry, you're muted right now.
Thank you very much. Super interesting. And I had really to think about the model. I can just jump with the question. But there is something that I also found very interesting and very difficult to study, which is the difference between the voting in presidential elections and midterm elections. And very often we have a reverse of fortune for political parties. And one discussion I had a long time ago was, well, maybe, people are prey to an informational cascade in the presidential election and no longer in the midterm. And therefore, there is a total change of probabilistic assessment, et cetera, et cetera. But what I find interesting in your model is it going from a simpler decision context to a more complex decision context? What can explain this change? Because beware that there isn't a good theory in political science about, why there is this shift, which is pretty, I won't say all the time, but pretty constant from presidential to midterm election. And one way I thought could be explained, but I couldn't do a model because I didn't have enough data, was information cascades, end of the cascade. But this complexity thing may be very interesting to test and to analyze, because it's still an unexplained problem.
That's really interesting. I hadn't thought about that implication, but to the extent that you, it would be interesting to see the extent of swings in presidential versus midterm elections. And if you make the assumption, and you could collect data on this, that presidential elections are viewed as more complex to think about it from the belief updating standpoint, then our model would predict more swings in presidential elections.
Do it.
Thank you. Yeah, that's a great idea.
I think it's a super interesting topic, and they haven't succeeded in explaining it. There are lots of different explanations, very incomplete. Let me see that.
Thank you. That's a great idea.
Okay.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much. It's a wonderful talk.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Christina and Alex. We have a couple more minutes. We go until 2:15 p.m. EST. I was going to say, as we wait for any further questions for Alex, there were 2 questions in the chat for Paul Deutschmann from his presentation earlier. So let's just turn to that. Paul, the 2 questions were, could you describe your developmental study a bit more? And the second question was, any further insights into people seeing others as being more impacted than they themselves are?
Yeah, so I responded to those messages in the chat, but just in short, on the developmental study, what we have done is presented a series of vignettes to children detailing different normative situations. I just manipulated whether they're getting a weak or a strong descriptive norm, much like we did with adults. And then just comparing those 2 conditions and finding a pretty big effect of descriptive norms on injunctive beliefs, moral evaluations, and their behavioral intentions across the vignettes. And interestingly, we're seeing a pattern of results that varies by the category of vignette. So for example, descriptive norms are influencing their beliefs for conventional behaviors, like talking in the library, but they're not for personal preferences, which we expected would be less sensitive to descriptive norms. And in a follow-up study that we're almost finished collecting data for, we're assessing kids' beliefs before and after presenting that information, so we can make claims about whether they're actually updating their beliefs like we find with adults. And then regarding the second question, I don't have more data specifically addressing the difference we're finding between second order and first order moral beliefs. But I think that is a really interesting pattern of results, and one that we weren't entirely expecting. So I'm hoping to do more work on that in the future.
Great, excellent. Thank you so much, Paul. Any further questions? I see that in the chat, we've answered everything. Any hands? I don't see them raised. If not any further questions, I think we can start wrapping up today's session, actually. Let me just share my screen very quickly for this last little bit here. But yeah, just an emphatic, thank you and appreciation to Alex and Paul for your excellent presentations and contributions today. This has been excellent, and the recording will be made available later on. We'll have it posted on our website and on YouTube. And also thank you to all participants who were here asking questions and engaging with the speakers and on the content. Just in terms of next time, we look forward to everyone's participation in the next NoBeC talk, which is going to be by Professor Giulia Andrighetto from the National Research Council of Italy on Thursday, October 12th. So until then, thank you again, everyone, and we can wrap up for today. Take care, everyone. Thank you.